it's an interesting idea to think you walk in there and you kind of just, you got all your stuff on the table, and he's like, it's gonna be $14, and you just like flash him a coin, and he's like, let me check on that, and you find out you didn't pay your last month's bill. My name is Richard Dix, and this is How Did That Happen? A podcast where I look at everyday things or events and try to figure out how they came to be. Every week I will research one topic, and by the end of the episode, I hope to truly have the answer to the question, how did that happen? All right. Thanks for tuning back in for another episode of HDTH. We're coming in with episode 44 this week, card-based transactions. And this was actually one that was given to me by a coworker. Someone asked me at work the other day. They were like, hey, do you know how credit cards happen? And I was like, no, do you? And they were like, oh, I thought that was your job. Like, they literally kind of, and I was like, oh, yeah, well, I guess let me put that one on the list. So that's what's coming at you today. Real fast before we get to it, what am I watching? I mean, I'm watching Dahmer like everybody else, right? Of course, I'm watching that. I was going to mention that, but I was like, let me do a little above and beyond, right? So what I did is I watched there's a very interesting interview between Dahmer's father and Oprah Winfrey out there on YouTube. You should give it a watch because it's interesting for a number of reasons. But it's like a half an hour, 45 minutes, but it's like it just adds on, and you really realize that a lot of that stuff that was in that show, it really happened. And his dad might not have been okay either. But I'm not gonna pass any judgment on anybody. But yeah, so that's what I've been watching. Let's see. I'm not sure. Like I said, I've been recording these a little bit earlier now and trying to get them banked a little bit. So I think by now we should have the mini episodes up there. Go ahead and drop the title. I believe it is Bite-Sized Bios is what it's going to be called. It'll either be coming out like Thursday, maybe Friday of every week, and it'll just be a little bit where we just do some small profiles of people in history and try to find out some interesting things. Let's see if there's anything else I need to cover. I don't really know. Let's see. Appreciate you guys, the love on the Twitter page. Like I said, I did buy a domain. I will be working on that and trying to get that hosting. But I guess without further ado, here's the episode. Money lending is one of the world's oldest professions. In fact, some of the earliest written laws in like human history pertain to the idea of lending money or goods. The concept of credit is goods that are traded, but the seller does not immediately receive payment. Instead, the debt is recorded and paid at a later date. So that's the whole idea of credit. Since we're getting into this whole card-based transactions idea. So beginning as far back as 9,000 BC with cattle and camels. Currency took some truly odd shapes, from anything from like shells, bronze, copper, gold and silver nuggets, to Chinese deerskin notes, and then Native Americans had some stringed beads that they would also use as like their form of currency. The concept of using a valueless instrument to represent banking transactions dates back thousands of years to a time when the ancient Mesopotamians used clay tablets to conduct trade with other civilizations. So we're gonna jump to the early modern uses of like card-based transactions, or the first times that's really even mentioned in some in pop culture. So the concept of using a card for purchases was described in 1887 by a man named Edward Bellamy in his utopian novel Looking Backward. And so Bellamy used the term credit card 11 times in this novel, and although this referred to this card that he was referring to was more for spending a citizen's dividend from the government rather than borrowing money, it is like one of the first times that you see it in the zeitgeist that credit cards are becoming a thing. Just period. You know what I mean? Like before, there weren't too many mentions of the actual idea of a credit card. Like I said, there's always been the idea of using a valueless instrument for credit, but to actually say this is going to be a credit card, the first time we really see it is in this guy's book. Now, as mentioned, there were, like I said, different things that people would use that were basically the early types of credit cards. They just weren't really called credit cards. Some of these happened around the 1860s. They were more like dog tag sort of things, and they went by different names. Or excuse me, I might be jumping ahead of myself there. I mean, they were the dog tag type charge tags, and then there were like charge coins as well that actually may have been, depending on who you ask, the predecessor, like the first one. Then they started right around the same time. They would usually have some sort of words on them that you would usually link them to whatever store or account that they were connected to, and they usually were only usable at one location. So it wasn't like a widespread thing. It was more like, you go to this one store, so you have a charge coin for this store. And they were usually given to customers who had charge accounts in hotels or department stores, which also could explain the link between department stores and credit cards. So basically, how it worked is the people would come into the store, and when they were about to buy something, they would just present the coin, and the cashier would check the number that was on the coin against a ledger to make sure the account was up to date. And these accounts were usually settled at the end of every month. So it's an interesting idea to think you walk in there and you kind of just, you got all your stuff on the table, and he's like, it's gonna be $14, and you just like flash him a coin, and he's like, let me check on that, and you find out you didn't pay your last month's bill. But let's see. So beginning in the late 19th century, charge cards came in various shapes and sizes, which was kind of like what I was saying earlier. There was really like just the wild, wild west. They were coming in copper, plastic, which was more like celluloid, steel, other types of metals and stuff, and paper slips even at that time were being used kind of in the same way. Then we cut to 1914 when Western Union launches metal money, which is basically a lot of people consider to be the first actual credit card, because it was essentially the same thing like what I was saying with the dog tag sort of looking kind of plate, and they would keep it in like a leather pouch, and you could make like a payment, but you could charge something, but you would have to pay for it at that time, and that's essentially what I guess you consider to be the first credit card. Gas companies were not too far behind, and they began offering credit cards that you could use to gas your car up and then maintain your car at their station. So basically, they would give you a card that you could use for gas for there, and if you had a problem with your car, you could also charge your expense, but only at that specific filling station or garage or what have you. And nice time to mention, we did do an episode on gas stations. I think it was episode 40. So if you want to know how they happen, you can go back to that. And then we get to 1936 when American Airlines and the Air Transport Association created their idea of credit cards for airplanes. And they also used a dog tag-like product that was popular at the time. And so they made it so the customer could sign a receipt for the flight in lieu of payment at the time they were about to get on the plane, and then pay it off later. And doing this is also, there was an incentive. So doing this, they would give them 15% off the actual flight. So it's like there is an incentive for like charging it as opposed to paying for it right there. 5 years later, those dog tag credit cards accounted for half of their revenue. So I mean, they really, and you'll see, and we'll get to this a little bit later about the whole idea of credit cards in the modern times, is that adding that incentive for using a credit card, it usually makes people want to do it. It really does. Even if you have the money, it's an interesting dynamic. So in 1946, a man by the name of John C. Biggins from Flatbush, New York, created the idea of the universal credit card, and he called it the Charge-A-Card. And this is really one of the first times that we see cards being used in more than one location. Like I said before, a lot of the early ones were like, you issued one to somebody, and they come back and they can only use it at that specific location. This is the idea, being that when the customer used the card, the business would charge the bank, who would then get the money from the customer. But when it started, it only worked at businesses that were in like a 2-mile radius of the bank itself. But I mean, you got to start somewhere. So that was the first bank to be like, here's a card, and you can go, buy some stuff, but only down the block, and then you don't have to pay for it right now. Doesn't that sound cool? And then later we'll collect that money from you. So that was 1946 with our man John C. Biggin. Then we cut to 1958, right, when Bank of America hopped in the game, and they did some, I guess I consider it to be fishy. So what they really did was they just basically they sent like activated credit cards to like every citizen in the city of Fresno in California back in 1958. So you open your mailbox and like boom, you have a credit card. You didn't ask for a credit card. You have a credit card, and it's already ready to go. You can spend, and like lo and behold, that didn't quite work out for them, because you're giving, in some cases, credit cards to people who don't have any money, and they're just spending money that they don't have. And so when you come collect on it, obviously it won't be there. But what it did do is show that the credit cards really do have a propensity to be a part of society, because people went out and just immediately started buying stuff. And so 8 years later, the Bank Americard went national to become the nation's first licensed general purpose credit card. So that is really the birth of credit cards. Excuse me. By 1970, Bank of America had passed on ownership of the Bank of Americard to a group of banks that would then manage it. That would then become Visa, basically, and then Visa went national in 1974. They issued their first debit card in 1975. And a little interesting fact I saw when I was looking this stuff up is that some of the original banks that were with Visa when it went public like 50 years ago, or almost 50 years ago, still have like the original stock from that merger. And it's like, can you imagine how much money that's worth? I mean, Visa is just they're valued at like, I don't know, like $500 billion or something like that. Like, it's wild. Okay, so this normally might be where I would maybe stop the podcast and hear that little sound, and I tell you that's how credit cards happen. But that's basically what happened with credit cards. But then there's really some other stuff that happened later on that made credit cards what they are right now. Because that we talked about credit cards, basically, Visa when they go public in the mid '70s, and that does create what we have as far as what credit cards were. But what they became is the subject of a little bit of controversy, and I'll read some of that to you right now. The first one that I'll mention, some of these are Supreme Court decisions. It's called the Marquette decision. And basically, have you ever wondered why some, if not all, of your credit card statements come from places like Sioux Falls, South Dakota, or like Wilmington, Delaware? And it's because in the late 90s, Sioux Falls was falling on hard times, and there was a recession in America, right? And so the banks in South Dakota, they weren't issuing very many loans. So in order to get banks to issue loans, what they did was South Dakota eliminated its cap on interest rates. And this is known as a usury law. If you're wondering what a usury law is, it's the illegal action or practice of lending money at unreasonably high rates of interest. And if you have any idea or have a credit card right now, that's pretty much what's happening. And like New York's usury laws didn't allow companies to collect more than 12% interest. And so this led the leaders of Citibank at the time to look for a new place to put their business. And so they start looking around for states that don't either don't have usury laws or have very high usury laws. And one of those places was South Dakota. So in 1981, Citibank moved its credit card headquarters from New York City to Sioux Falls, South Dakota. And this, like I said, was all the product of the Supreme Court ruling known as the Marquette decision, which said that states could export their interest rates to other states, basically. And it's officially known as the Marquette National Bank of Minneapolis versus the First of Omaha Service Corp. And for just an example, if you were to let's say make a loan from South Dakota and their interest rate limit is 20%, then you could charge that rate to someone in Florida, and it's completely legal now. It's like for the first time in history, there were no legal restrictions on the interest rates banks could charge across the country, and that's kind of where we get into the wild west of what credit cards are. Like when it first started, it wasn't like that. It was very central, or very central to where you were. Whatever bank you got it from could only charge based off the limit in their state. Now all your bank has to do is move to a state with a very high limit or no limit at all, and they can charge you whatever they want, do like whatever they want with these interest rates. And they call this in the biz, they call it the true lender doctrine. And of course, like I said, from there, all the big banks wanted to get involved, and some people said it was wrong because it allowed institutions to charge higher interest rates to less than qualified individuals. We see that there's another landmark decision for credit cards in the Supreme Court in 1996. We have the case of Smiley versus Citibank, and this just basically took the cap off of what could be charged for late fees. And so they just chipped away at another part of the institution. So now, before there was a cap saying you can only charge this, the borrower, this amount of money if they missed their late fees. They took that off now. If they can kind of just charge whatever they want if you miss a payment, and that is also legal and is held up in the Supreme Court. There's not too much more. Like I said, the whole base of it is what we kind of went through before with the card-based transactions. Is just once I started doing the research for this and I saw all this stuff as well, I was just like, I have to share it because I knew none of this. I knew that of course, like anybody, I have a credit card, and I think it does come from Delaware. I've seen them come from South Dakota too. So it's just like when you see that, you're like, oh, I kind of do want to know why all that happens, and you see this is exactly why. We'll just run through the idea of credit scores. Credit score is determined by a FICO score, and the company that determines that score is called Fair Isaac, oddly enough. And they get their information from the normal credit reporting agencies like Experian and TransUnion. And basically what they do is they take that information and put it against, I guess they said like an algorithm or something. And then that is what then gets you your credit score. So I always thought that it was Experian and TransUnion who were making the credit scores. They're not even the ones that are making the credit scores. They're just collecting information and then giving it to somebody else and then giving you a number back. So just interesting information about credit scores. Let's see. Is there one there? Yeah, there's one more thing. I wanted to mention a big part of the credit card technology. We're actually going to talk about another part in the next couple segments, but this is the last bit before we move on to rounding it up. In the 1960s, the IBM engineer Forrest Perry invents the magnetic strip that's used on credit card and identification badges. And he has this idea of gluing short pieces of magnetic tape to each plastic card, but the glue warped the tape and then made it unusable. you couldn't really either fall off or